You're a sixth grader growing up in Hawaii and you see a plant. What happens?
I see a plant and I wonder to myself, how did that plant land on this remote island in the middle of the Pacific? Did it get here by itself or through birds or through humans? And then I wonder, and once it got here, how did it interact with the environment? How did it respond to the unique soil and sun and water options that it had available to it? And how did that happen at a chemical level? How did the DNA change to allow that plant to survive in that environment?
And the leaves close to the touch? Is that what happens?
That's right, leaves close to the touch. So it was a plant that we were fascinated with as kids. We called it sleeping grass. That was our name for it, because it would literally close up and go to sleep when you touched it, but it also had prickers. So it was a good plant to try to avoid.
So obviously you were a very curious kid.
Well, that could be interpreted in different ways, but, but yes.
So, as in, you had a lot of questions.
I definitely asked a lot of questions, that's true.
When you're in sixth grade, your father gives you a book, and this book has a big impact, yes?
In the sixth grade, my father gave me a dog-eared copy of the Double Helix by Jen Watson. And that had a big effect on me. I was astounded to learn that scientists could do experiments to figure out something like the structure of a molecule. It was amazing.
And is this book sort of like your version of Harry Potter? I mean, something you just devour?
I would say that when I read the Double Helix, it was a challenging book to read scientifically for me at that time, to really understand the science, and I really didn't understand all the science. But this book was written in an interesting way because it really talked a lot about the human side of doing science and the personalities involved and the clashes involved. And I was amazed to learn that scientists were, very human. They had challenges they had to deal with in the course of doing their research. So it really opened the door for me to think about how one could imagine doing science as even as a kid growing up in Hawaii.
You yourself say that it wasn't the easiest book to read. What was it about you that made you sort of push through, to persevere and finish reading the book?
I've always been a person who is very determined. I'm determined. If I decide I'm going to do something, I just sort of push through and try to do it. And in the case of this book by Jim Watson, I found that I was so fascinated by the subject that even though I didn't really understand all the science, I was really motivated to try to understand enough that I could make sense of what he was describing. And it was clearly very much about a profoundly impactful stage in biological research.
Your father was a professor, but he wasn't a professor in the sciences. He was a professor of literature.
My dad was a professor of American literature, and he loved reading. He loved poking around in old bookshops, and so he would often throw books my way and kind of see what took.
I guess I'm wondering what made him give you that book instead of, say, a great novel.
My father, often gave me all sorts of books. He gave me great novels, but he also gave me books that he thought would be interesting, I think, to me, given that he could see, I think, that I was drawn to the sciences. I was drawn to the natural world. I think when I read the Double Helix, I was amazed at the process of doing science, both the technical side, but also the human side of it. And for me, it was kind of a window into a world I knew nothing about, but felt fascinated by. And rather than asking myself, could I ever do something like, solve the structure of an important molecule like DNA, it was more for me about, could I spend my life answering questions about the natural world, and wouldn't that be an amazing thing to be able to do? And that was really the beginning for me of, not rather than being about solving a particular problem, I'd say it was more about realizing that I could be part of a process, part of the whole fabric of the research community that were chipping away at sort of fundamental truths about human existence on the planet.
You realize now that parents everywhere are going to give their kids the Double Helix.
Well, I think that wouldn't be a bad thing.
Is there a concise way of explaining what CRISPR is?
I think CRISPR is best described as a surgical tool for changing the code of life. It's a little protein machine. It's made naturally by bacteria as a way to defend themselves against viral infection. And they do that by cutting up viral DNA. And the way they recognize viral DNA is by literally programming this enzyme, which is called Cas9, to find and cut viral DNA sequences. And it turns out that this is a protein that, once its function was understood, could be harnessed for a very different purpose, namely for cutting DNA sequences in animal and plant and human cells that allow cells to make very precise changes to that genetic code.
What was your vision for what CRISPR could do?
I remember being in my kitchen with my son. I was cooking dinner and I was thinking about the day's results in the laboratory and the work that was described to me by Martin Ginnick, a person, very wonderful scientist who was doing experiments on Cas9 in my lab, and thinking about how the mechanism of this enzyme as a programmable protein that could cut DNA sequences could be harnessed as a very different kind of tool than had been available in the past. It was really exciting to think about using it as a way to induce cells to make changes precisely to particular parts of their genetic code.
You also had a nightmare about how the technology could be misused.
Very early on, I realized, as labs around the world began adopting the CRISPR-Cas9 tool for gene editing, it became clear that this was such a powerful technology that was very exciting on the one hand, but also could bring very profound challenges to humans who would need to figure out how to regulate the use of this technology. And I had a dream that I think really kind of captured that emotion, which was about being led into a dark room and invited to explain the CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing technology to a very well-known person. And when that person turned around in his chair, I realized to my horror that it was Adolf Hitler.
Right. So, I'm wondering then how much of, you were obviously haunted by that, how much of what propelled you was kind of a moral imperative, a hope for doing things for the world to make it a better place?
I guess I've always done science thinking, at least in the back of my mind, that the work that I'm doing and that I'm doing with all of the people that I interact with in my own lab and as collaborators would have a positive impact on the human condition. That's sort of a lofty goal, but I think many scientists feel that we want our work to lead to a better world, to solving real problems. And so when I recognized the potential for gene editing to have really exciting positive outcomes, but also potentially big risks and negative kinds of applications, I felt very strongly that I needed to be engaging in the public discussion of this technology, trying to explain it as an educator, be involved in educating the public really about this important technology, and encouraging a very active discussion about how it should be used.